Hello and welcome to Botany 101. My name is Angela Nishimoto and I'm your tour for this part of the plant kingdom. Okay, we started off last time with, or the time before, with non-vascular plants, the Bryophyta and the Hepaticophyta and the Anthocerophyta. Okay, and we also did the Xylophyta. All right, the Xylophyta are part of the ferns and their fern allies. Okay, so today we're going to start with the lycophytes. Okay, so today we're doing ferns and their relatives, part 2. Okay, and we're going to start off with the phylum Lycophyta. All right, now these include the ground pines, the one you see on the left, right over here. Okay, the spike mosses. Okay, and the quillworts. Okay, you can see that they look rather different. Okay, so that's one of the things you're learning as you're doing botany, is you're learning that plants really do look different from each other. I remember that I have students every semester in my classes, face-to-face classes, that say, you know, whenever I looked at plants, they all look the same, but after this class, I really see that they're different from one another. So this is an example of a ground pine or a lycopod, a spike moss or Selaginella, and a quillwort. Okay, so these are all in the phylum Lycophyta. Okay, so there are certain similarities even though you can see that they're different. Okay, so there are about 950 species of club mosses. All right, and why do they call them club mosses? Or they used to anyway. They look enough like true mosses that we covered before. Remember the Bryophyta, okay? That Linnaeus actually lumped them into the same class. You remember when we were talking about taxonomy, we talked about lumpers and splitters, right? So Linnaeus actually lumped the club mosses into the same class as true mosses, but subsequently, okay? Once details were known about the club mosses, it was very obvious that they were not related to the true mosses, okay? So now, of course, they're still called the club mosses, but they are not, definitely not true mosses, okay? Now there are 2 major genera and 2 minor genera of lycophytes, okay, of club mosses, all right? Now the sporophytes have microphyls, and the microphyls are small leaves. Micro means small, and phyl refers to leaf, okay? But they also have true stems and true roots, okay? Remember that when we talked about the xylophytes, that the xylophytes do have stems, but they don't have true roots. But here, for the first time, you actually have a group that has true roots, okay? Now, one of the major genera is Lycopodium, with about 50 species. Okay, here you can see some Lycopodiums. Okay, you can see their reproductive structures at the tips here. Okay, and the other major genus is Selaginella. Okay, with more than 700 species. So here are some examples of Selaginella plants. Okay. Now these plants are abundant in the tropics and wetter temperate areas, but they're distributed throughout the world. Okay. The Lycopodiums, or the ground pines, are also known as ground pines. Okay. They're often grow on forest floors, and one of the reasons why they're called ground pines is that they sort of look like little Christmas trees with cones. Okay, the cones, of course, are the strobili. Okay, and the strobili can be upright or pendant. Okay, so here are some strobili here, this kind of yellowish part of these plants here. You can see these tend to be upright, standing up. Okay, some species have those strobili that are pendant, that hang down. Okay, so stems may be simple, like a single stem from a rhizome, or it may be branched. Okay, and most of them are under a foot tall. okay, but some in the tropics grow to more than 5 feet tall, okay? So stems develop from rhizomes. Do you remember, I just mentioned rhizomes. Do you remember what rhizomes are? Okay, what is a rhizome? Think about it, okay? A rhizome, okay, I'm about to tell you, is actually a vertical underground stem. I'm sorry, a horizontal underground stem. I'm getting all mixed up here, okay? Anyway, so a rhizome is a horizontal underground stem, okay? And as a stem, it has nodes and internodes, okay? Now, another thing too is that leaves of lycopods, okay, of lycopodium, are rarely more than half an inch long, or they're less than half an inch long, okay? They truly are microphyls, okay? And they have adventitious roots growing from the rhizome. If you remember what the adventitious roots are roots that grow from places that you don't expect a root to grow from, like from a stem, like from a rhizome, okay? So here you go. Here's some lycopodiums. Here's a strobilus. You can see that these branches have, this one is branched. It actually has very, very small leaf-like structures on them. Okay, they're not really true leaves, but they call them microphyls. See, they're kind of fuzzy looking, yeah, but these are really truly microphyls. They're very small. And here you have the strobilus, yeah, the spore producing structure. Okay, so this is a nice picture. So here are some ground pines that are actually growing on the ground. Okay, because some are epiphytic too. Okay. Now some produce sporangia, or spore-bearing structures, on short stalks in the axils of the leaves. Okay, these kinds of leaves are called sporophylls, right? There are other species. Remember, SPP stands for species in plural. They have sporophylls with no chlorophyll. That sounds like a little rhyme. Sporophylls with no chlorophyll, right? Okay, and they're terminal clusters. That means they're at the ends. Here, okay? So you actually have the strobili, okay, which are singular strobilus. And here you have an image, okay, of the strobilus, okay, made of sporangia underneath, okay. And here you can see the microphyls on the stem of this plant. Can you see how small they are? They're quite small, okay. Now in the sporangia, the sporocytes do meiosis, okay. A sporocyte is just a cell that produces spores, okay. They produce spores that are carried away by air, so these are wind dispersed, okay. So then the spores will germinate in a few days or several years. It depends on the location and where they land, if the location is suitable for them to germinate and grow, okay? And the gametophytes develop in the ground with the help of mycorrhizae. Remember what mycorrhizae are? Okay, remember that mycorrhizae are fungi that live in symbiosis with the roots of plants. So all the way from the bryophytes in here to the lower vascular plants, you see mycorrhizae. So mycorrhizae are these fungi. Symbiotic fungi are extremely important to the life of plants on the earth. And if they're important to the life of plants, they're important to our lives too, because we cannot live without plants. Remember, that's one of the first lessons you learned. Okay. So some of these gametophytes develop on the surface of the ground. Okay. Some of them develop underground. Okay. And they vary in shape. They usually don't have color, but the exposed parts that are exposed to light do green up. Okay. Here we have some sporophytes of lycopods here. Got these nice images. Don't the woodlands look fertile? Okay. Now all of these gametophytes produce male and female structures. Okay. And the sperms are flagellated. Okay, so they need water in order to affect fertilization. Okay? So then after fertilization, the zygotes, the single-celled result of fertilization of an egg and a sperm, develops into embryos with roots, stem, and leaves. Okay? And that develops into the sporophyte. Okay? So several sporophytes might be produced from one gametophyte. Okay? And some of the ground pines actually do asexual reproduction as well. They will actually develop bulbils, okay, in the axils of their leaves. You know, the leaves are coming out like this, and there'll be bulbils in the axils between them. Yeah? And each of these bulbils has the capacity of growing into a whole new sporophyte. Isn't that interesting? Right? Okay. Now reproduction. Okay, so here we have a life cycle of the Lycopodium. Okay, so why don't we start with the sporophyte? Okay, so the sporophyte, of course, is diploid. Here's a strobilus here. Okay, so here it is developing, and here's a strobilus with its chambers. Okay, and here's a sporophyll. Okay, on the strobilus. Okay, developing a sporangium. All right, which undergoes meiosis. It produces spores that are carried by the wind to wherever they will settle, that will develop into a gametophyte. Okay, so you have the female parts, you have the male parts, the female parts with the archegonia, okay, the male parts with the antheridia, okay, like the other plants we've seen before. Okay, so then you have the sexual parts developing here. We have the archegonium and the antheridium. Okay, and the sperms are flagellated, and when water splashes or where there's water present, the sperm will swim, okay, into the archegonium and fertilize the egg. So here's a flagellated sperm, and here's the egg, just waiting to be fertilized. Okay, that's the whole purpose of it. That's the whole purpose of life, it seems, for us to grow and live and then reproduce. That's a evolutionary thought, anyway. Okay. Now the Selaginella are the spike mosses. Okay, Selaginella is a genus. Okay, there are approximately or about or more than 700 species that are abundant in the tropics. They're also scattered around the world in wet areas. Okay, they tend to have more branches. They branch more freely than the ground pines that we just saw, the Lycopodiums. Okay, a few Selaginella species are weeds or kind of pests in greenhouses, depending on where you are, because for some places they're very desirable plants to grow, and other places they're weeds. And what's a weed? It's just a plant that's growing where you don't want it to grow. Okay, now they differ from the Lycopodiums, okay, by the fact that their leaves have a ligule, or at least one ligule, which is a tiny extra appendage, okay, or some kind of layer on the upper surface and on the base. We'll try to show you a ligule later. I don't know if we can actually get it focused with the camera, but I have a little sample that I can show you, okay? Another important difference of Selaginella and Lycopodium is that Selaginella produces two kinds of spores, okay? Microspores and megaspores. Okay, microspores being male and megaspores being female. Okay, so they produce two types of spores and two types of gametophytes. Okay, male and female, and that condition is known as heterospory. Okay, up to now we've had homospory. Okay, all the spores were the same, or at least, you know, they weren't sexed. Okay. Now reproduction, you have sporangia that are on microsporophylls or megasporophylls. So always remember, the woman is the bigger one, or the female is the bigger one. Okay, so micro is a male, mega is a female. Okay. Now these microsporophylls, the male part, will bear microsporangia containing microsporocytes, the sites that actually undergo meiosis and produce microspores. Okay. That was a mouthful. Okay, and the microspore many become male gametophytes. Okay, of the microspores, okay? And a male gametophyte is a spherical antheridium, so we still have antheridiums, okay, within a microspore, okay? And there are, let's see, 128 or 256 sperms with flagella produced in the antheridium. So here too, this plant needs water in order to do sexual reproduction, okay? Now the female, the megasporophylls bear megasporangia containing a megasporocyte that produces 4 megaspores through meiosis, okay? And the megaspore becomes a female gametophyte, okay? So this female gametophyte may consist of many cells, like hundreds, thousands of cells, okay? It can grow and ruptures the spore wall and produces archegonia in the exposed seams that came about through the rupture, okay? Not the rapture, the rupture, okay? So gametophytes often develop before spores are released from sporangia, okay? Which is kind of like an interesting thing, okay? So they start to develop before they're released, okay? And then fertilization happens, and sporophyte development are similar to those of the ground pines, okay? So here we're going to have the reproduction or the life cycle of Selaginella, okay? So one thing you see is that this slide has images that are colorized, okay? So here on the strobilus of Selaginella, you have the mega part of it, okay, and the micro part of it, okay? The mega or the female, and the micro or the male, okay? So you see the on the strobilus, okay, you have the microsporangia being developed, the megasporangia being developed, okay? Then on it you'll have a megasporophyll, okay, that will produce megagametophytes, okay, or a megagametophyte, okay, and the microsporophyll that will produce microgametophyte, okay, microgametophyte, okay. So here's a megagametophyte, here's a microgametophyte. And the megagametophyte, of course, is larger. The microgametophyte is smaller, okay? And the microgametophyte produces these flagellated sperm. Remember, it's actually just an antheridia with sperms, right? So it has this flagellated sperm that swims in and fertilizes the egg in the archegonium, okay? And then you have the development of the embryo, then the development of the sporophyte, that then eventually produces a strobilus, and the sexual cycle continues, okay? Now the third group, okay, in the club mosses, or the club mosses and the quillworts, is called isoedes. They're called the quillworts, okay? They're not that familiar to us here in Hawaii because they're more like maybe cool area kind of plants. But there are about 60 species, and all of them are in the genus Isoedes, okay? And they're all found in areas with standing water for at least part of the year, okay? The microphylls or the small leaves, are spoon-shaped at the bases, okay? They sort of look like porcupine quills, okay? They're not stiff or rigid. And they're arranged in a tight spiral on a stubby stem, which is a corm, okay? The stem is a corm. Remember corms? We've seen corms before. We've seen corms on Kalo or Taro, Colocasia esculenta, right? So these corms have a vascular cambium, okay? They may live for years, okay, many years, okay? Now there are ligules around the leaf bases, okay? Another thing too is, here's a quillwort, okay? So you can see that it's kind of sitting in standing water. You can see that the bases are sort of spoon-shaped here at the bottom. You can see that the leaves look sort of like a quill, like a porcupine quill, okay? They love water, okay? And of course, they don't really live in Hawaii, okay? It's not cool enough for them here, okay? So, on the mainland, birds and muskrats eat the corms. They're edible. Okay, people can eat the corms too. Okay. So plants are usually less than 4 inches tall, but there are leaves of one species that are 2 feet. Okay, and here they are. They're quite attractive plants, aren't they? Okay, now their reproduction are also, okay, are similar to spike mosses, but they don't form strobili, okay? So both types of sporangia, okay, the megasporangia and the microsporangia, are produced at the bases of the leaves, okay? And there may be up to 1 million microspores in a single microsporangium. Yeah, that's pretty amazing, I think. Okay. Now about their ancient relatives of this group, of the groups that we've been talking about. Okay. There are some extinct relatives of club mosses that are large and tree-like, or were, okay, large and tree-like. They're up to 100 feet tall. Okay. The trunks were to 3 feet wide in diameter. And they were the dominant vegetation in forests and swamps of the Carboniferous period, okay, which peaked about 325 million years ago, okay. Those are the club mosses, okay, the Lycopodium and Selaginella, the extinct relatives of them, okay. Now the quillworts appeared later during the Cretaceous area, about 130 million years ago. Okay, and the fossils are similar to present-day relatives. Okay, now you might think, oh, why are we talking about these plants? They're so sort of like an aesthete, you know, they're aesthetic, you know, they're so specialized, you know, they're so marginal, okay? Because the thing too is that, so here is looking at a fossil, okay, similar to present-day relatives. So you might think, why are we looking at these? Okay, well, partly because if you have the knowledge of the life cycle and the history of some of these plants that we've been talking about, we can better understand the whole kingdom Plantae a little better. The descendants and the phylogeny and how they're related to each other and how they developed and how they evolved. Okay, so it's important to understand every little bit of everything you study, you know, in order to learn more about it, okay? Now, the human and ecological relevance of this group, okay? As you can kind of tell from what we've been talking about, they're of little economic importance. You probably know that from your own experience, okay? So today, they're of little economic importance. But many club mosses have spores that have a lot of oil in them. So what they do, they light up when they're lit, okay? They have been used for theatrical explosives and photographic flash. You know, like you see those old Western pictures where some guy is in a camera under like a dark hood, and he has a little V-shaped tray in one hand, he has a thing in another, he lights it and the whole thing flashes. And that's what it was used for photographic flash, and that was important in the early history of photography. And of course, since then we've progressed to that, so we don't use that so much anymore. In fact, when I was in the Department of Botany, one of the professors had a whole big bottle, okay, of these lycopod spores, and some of the male graduates, none of the female, but some of the male graduate students actually lit them during lab and had like a explosion in lab, you know. I mean, nothing caught on fire or anything, but it was very theatrical and very dramatic, and of course the students were very interested in it, so that was kind of good, you know. Okay. Also, the druggists used to use a spore powder. They used to mix it with pills to keep the pills from sticking to each other. Okay. And the spore powder has been used medicinally for various purposes. Okay. For so there's some club moss powder. Okay. Looks like a kind of specialized jar. Looks expensive. Okay. So they were used for urinary disorders and stomach upsets. Okay. And some Native Americans use the spores for talcum powder for babies, you know, similar to how Native Hawaiian men used to use the spores from the Psilotum for like talcum powder for malo to create chafing, prevent chafing. Okay, they also use it for snuff, for nosebleeds. They use it as an after childbirth treatment to stanch hemorrhaging. Okay, and they also use it to stop bleeding from wounds. Okay. Now their club moss extracts were used for fevers too, but then what they found out is that using club moss spores and other parts had undesirable side effects, so the medicinal uses have been largely abandoned. Okay, now more about club mosses. Native Americans of Washington State, Oregon, British Columbia used to become intoxicated after chewing parts of local species of club moss. Okay, they actually passed out if they chewed too much of this club moss. Okay, another thing is it's like a novelty store, you know, actually stock these. So a novelty store sells spike moss known as the resurrection plant. Okay, and this plant is native to Mexico and southwestern United States. What happens is it shrivels and rolls into a ball when it's dry. Okay, it actually looks dead, so that's why they call it the resurrection plant, because what happens is that when you water it, it quickly unfolds and turns green. Okay, and there are other spike mosses that you can kind of put on a shelf for up to 3 years without watering them, and when you water them, they start growing again. Isn't that amazing? Yeah, so there's some amazing things with some of these kind of plants here. Okay, now ground pines and spike mosses are also used ornamentally as ground covers. Okay, some people use them as Christmas ornaments or in wreaths. They usually spray paint them and use them for Christmas decorations. Now quillwort corms are eaten by domestic animals and wild animals, waterfowl, and humans, amazingly. Okay? And some lycopodiums are on the endangered species list, or they're on threatened lists. Okay, so they should not be collected. So some lycopodiums are on the verge of extinction. Okay? Anyway, so that finishes our tour of the Lycophyta. Okay, now we have the phylum Equisitophyta. Okay, and these are the horsetails and the scouring rushes. Okay, so the horsetails are the branching forms that kind of resembles a horse's tail. Okay, and the scouring rushes are the unbranched forms. Okay, and here's one that looks like it's a branching form. Aren't they pretty? Look at that. You can see the little microphyls, and these things are little branches sticking out. Okay, so that's a horsetail. Okay, so there are approximately 25 species on all continents. Okay, and they're considered weeds in Australia, in some parts of Australia. And these plants are also not that big. They're usually less than 4 feet tall. But there are some that grow taller than 15 feet in the tropics, okay? Also in the coastal redwood forests of California. Okay, so here's some unbranched scouring rushes. Okay, they tend to live in wet places, okay? So they branch in whorls along a jointed stem. Okay, so here are some branches. And these are the microphyls, these kind of brown parts here. These are the actual leaves of the plants. Okay, the microphyls, we'll see in a minute, are in whorls at the node. So here's a node, and they're in a whorl and a node. Okay, so we'll see that. So the microphyls are in whorls at nodes. Okay, they're fused at the bases, so they form like a collar, and that's this colorless part here. Okay, they're usually green at first, but then they wither and fade. They get dry and fade. So generally, the photosynthesis in these plants happens in the stem. Okay? Another thing is the stems are ribbed. They have obvious nodes and internodes. Okay? They also have many stomates in the grooves, you know, where the ribbing is on the stems. Okay? And these aerial stems also grow from a rhizome, similar to the lycopods, and also similar to the xylophytes. Okay? So here you see a bunch. You can actually see here, kind of vaguely, it's kind of small, but you can see here the microphyls at the nodes. Okay. So I think they're attractive plants. The reproduction. Okay. If the stems or rhizomes are broken up like by a tornado or by a storm or by some kind of wild animals, okay, what can happen is that the pieces can grow into new plants. And what is this called? What kind of reproduction is this? Right? It doesn't have to do with two parents. It has to do with one parent. So it's asexual reproduction or vegetative reproduction, because you have new plants growing from the stems of this plant, or maybe even from the roots from this plant, because this plant also has true roots. Okay? But in most species, reproduction is sexual. Okay? They develop strobili at the stem tips. Okay, they're about 3/4 to 1.5 inches long, depending on the species, and they have sporangia in them. Okay? Now, when the sporocytes, oh here, I'm sorry, I'm jumping to the next slide. So here are the strobili. Okay, here are the microphyls, kind of brownish at the nodes, obvious nodes. It's kind of hard to see, but the stems are ribbed. Okay, it actually led them to be called scouring brushes, because people could use them to scour pots and pans with. Okay, because they have silica in the walls of the cells of the outside of the epidermis. Okay, silica, of course, is a component of glass. So when the sporophytes in the sporangia do meiosis, okay, green spores are produced. Okay, like on one side of the spores, they have 4 elaters. Okay, these elaters are not related to the elaters in hornworts or liverworts. Okay, so they're like, you know, like limbs sticking out, like your legs and your arms sticking out. Okay, the elaters. Okay, so what happens then is that the elaters aid spore dispersal. So when the spores are in the air, like in the dry air, the elaters are extended. Okay, and when it enters a humid air pocket, which implies that there might be humid or moist soil underneath, the elaters coil around the spore, and then the spore drops, okay, onto maybe a place where it's very likely to support germination and growth in a moist spot. Okay, so the elaters are used for dispersal. Okay, so here's looking at a strobilus with these parts kind of sticking up, and the sporangia are under here. Okay, sporangia are very small. Okay, that's looking at a strobilus close up, okay, with its parts. Okay, now the spore tends to germinate within about a week of release. Okay, and it results in a green gametophyte with rhizoids. Okay, they can grow up to a little less than 1/2 inch in diameter. Another thing about them is that about approximately half of the gametophyte are males with antheridia, and about half of the gametophyte is female with archegonia. Okay, or half are male, half are female. Okay, but after about a month, the females of most species, they become bisexual. Okay, they produce only antheridia from then on. Okay, interestingly enough, I know some fishes do that too. Yeah. Anyway, so water contacts the antheridia and the sperms are explosively ejected. Okay, and you can have several eggs on a female or a bisexual gametophyte. Okay, so the gametophyte may be fertilized, and also the development of more than one sporophyte on the gametophyte is common. Okay. Now, ancient relatives. The single remaining genus of the ancient relatives is Equisetum. Okay. Of course, equus means horse, right? So the phylum had several orders, and they flourished in the Carboniferous period about 300 million years ago. Okay. Some were tree-like, more than 50 feet tall. Okay. Others were vine-like, and there were some that were similar to the modern horsetails with leaves and whorls. Okay, so here's a strobilus here. Here you can see the microphyls all kind of clustered and dried around a node here. You may be able to see a little bit of the ribbing along the stem here. Okay. Now, of course, what is all the relevance of this? Okay. Okay, 7th century Romans ate field horsetails as young strobili. And how did they do it? They boiled it or they fried it after mixing it with flour. Okay. Now, Native Americans ate the inner parts, which are raw or boiled. They peeled off first the tough epidermis. Okay. Then others cooked the rhizomes of giant horsetails to eat. Okay. Also, cows and goats and muskrats and bears and geese have been observed eating horsetails. Okay. The Hopi people ground dried horsetail stems to flour and mix it with cornmeal to make bread or mush. Okay. Now the thing too is that horsetails are sometimes reported poisonous to horses, and now they do not recommend for humans to eat this. Okay? All right? Even though there's more uses. Okay, one tribe of American natives drank water from the carinal canals, okay, of the stem. Another tribe thought that the shoots were good for the blood. Okay? And there is an old report by some biologists that the field horsetail consumption produces an increase in blood corpuscles. Okay, so that's supposed to be good. Okay. So it's reported too that 1 or 2 species have a diuretic effect. What does that mean? That it means that it increases the flow of urine and has been used for urinary and bladder disorders. Okay. Some species were used as an acid. Okay. Some species were used as an astringent. Okay. One species was used for the treatment of gonorrhea. Okay, because I think gonorrhea actually originated in the New World. Okay. Others were used for tuberculosis. Okay, here's medicine made from horsetail. I think people still use horsetail to treat varicose veins too. I think you can probably find it at the health food store. Okay. Now, Native American tribes use the burnt ashes from the stem for sore mouths. Okay, or also for severe burns. Okay. Another tribe ate the strobili of the scouring rush for diarrhea. Okay. Others yet boiled stems in water for hair wash for parasites, for lice and fleas and mites. Okay. Now during pioneer times, when covered wagons moved toward the west, okay, the use of scouring rush stems were used for scouring and sharpening, cleaning pots and pans, polishing brass and hardwood furniture, hardwood flooring, and to hone mussel shells to a sharp edge, okay, for cutting. Okay, and these uses are still used today. So it's the scouring rush is still in limited use for these purposes today. Some people still use it, craftsmen like that. Okay. So now about the geological past. Okay, giant horsetails and club mosses grew in swampy areas. Okay, and some swamps were stagnant and sinking. Okay, so what you had was a gradual accumulation of plant remains, and that gave you some coal formation. So with coal formation, if you actually get a piece of soft coal and you slice it thin enough and you look at it under a microscope, you can actually see spores and parts of plants that lived hundreds of millions of years ago. Okay? In fact, there's a kind of coal called cannel coal that actually is made up of the spores of giant club mosses and giant horsetails, okay, from millions of years ago that have been reduced to pure carbon, okay? Okay, next we're going to do the phylum Polypodiophyta. That's a mouthful, huh? And these are the ferns, okay? Now the ferns are very popular plants, especially ornamental plants, okay? So special and so beautiful that Thoreau was moved to say or write that God made ferns to show what he could do with leaves, okay? Leaves are very varied. Leaves are also very aesthetically pleasing, okay? Okay, so there are about 11,000 species of ferns. You have them ranging from tiny floating ferns less than half an inch, okay, to giant tropical tree ferns more than 80 feet tall. Okay, so this looks like Lawaya fern. Okay, so the leaves are actually megaphylls. They're actually true leaves. Okay, and they're often called fronds. They have leaf gaps and branching veins, so that's a true leaf. True leaves have leaf gaps and branching veins. Okay, typically the leaves are divided and feathery, but there are some that are undivided, pleated, or tongue-like. Okay, there are others like a four-leaf clover, such as Marsilia villosa, which is a rare Hawaiian fern. Marsilia villosa. Okay, so here you can see the four-parted leaves of this kind of small fern. I have an example of it, I'll show you later, but it kind of folded up on me, so I don't know how much of it we can see. Okay, or they actually form nests, like the Asplenium nidus, which is native to Hawaii, the Ikaha fern. Okay, the Ikaha. So you can see one as a volunteer, as an epiphyte up here in this tree. And it actually does form a structure that looks a little like a nest. Okay. And the nest accumulates humus. Okay. So these need water to do sexual reproduction. Okay, just like a lot of the plants that we've seen so far. I think all the plants that we've seen so far, they can do sexual reproduction only with water. So ferns are most abundant in wetter areas, but a few are adapted to drier areas. Like there are some ferns in Hawaii that live on bare lava flows. Yeah, there are a lot of rain there, but still on the Big Island, you know. Okay, so the sporophyte is made up of fronds, rhizome, and adventitious roots. Okay. When young, the fronds are coiled at the tip. Okay. They form something called a fiddlehead. So this is that picture you saw a little earlier. So here's a frond unfurling. They form something called a fiddlehead, or they form something called a crozier, which is like the top of a cane that somebody uses to walk with. Or it's like the end of the fiddle with this part being the place where you put your fingers, and further down the part where you actually do the bow across the strings. Yeah? So all ferns have fiddleheads, okay? And the fiddleheads unroll and expand, okay? As you saw in some examples that you've seen already, the blades are often divided into pinnae, like you see in this fern here. So you have pinnately compound leaves in some ferns. Okay, and they're attached to a rachis, which is actually the midrib of the leaf. Okay, and at the base you have a petiole. Okay, just like other leaves, right? Now, mature fronds have patches on their lower surface. Okay, some people who don't know what they are worry that they might be a fungus and they try to scrape it off, but when they're doing that, they're actually frustrating the sexual reproduction of these plants. Okay, so some of them have them. Okay, most of them have them, and these are clusters of sporangia, known as sori. Okay, singular sorus. Okay, and the sori are protected by a little plate called an indusia, or indusium, plural indusia. Okay, and sporangua are microscopic and they're stalked, and there's a row of cell at the edge. It's called an annulus. Okay, and it catapults the spores out. It actually flings the spores out. Okay, depending on the humidity. Okay, so then the sporocytes do meiosis in the sporangia. Okay, and what you end up with is 48 or 64 spores per sporangium. Okay, but the adder's tongue fern may have 15,000 spores. Okay, the adder tongue fern sporangia may have 15,000 spores. It's also furthermore estimated that one beech fern will produce 50 million spores. Can you imagine? That's kind of astronomical numbers. Kind of a little overage, I think. Okay. Now in Marsilia, which you saw a little earlier, Marsilia, there are two kinds of spores produced in Marsilia, I guess megaspores and microspores, and a few others. But in almost all ferns, there's only one kind of spore. Okay. And the spores are dispersed by wind, but few end up where they can survive. You know, they need kind of shady, wet ledges or crevices or moist soil. Okay, but when they do germinate, they produce something called an Irish valentine. Okay, these are a prothallus. Okay, they're green and they're heart-shaped gametophyte. Okay, about a 1/4 inch in diameter. Okay, and they're visible without a microscope. Okay, so here's look at the little heart-shaped gametophyte here. Okay, they're usually only one cell thick, except towards the center. Okay, so they're only one cell thick. They're very thin. You can look at them under the microscope. They make microscope slides out of these prothalli, and you can look at them under the microscope. Okay. So the antheridia are interspersed among rhizoids on the gametophyte, and they produce 32 to hundreds of flagellated sperms. Okay, here's some sperms in progress. Okay. The archegonia are closer to the notch of the heart-shaped gametophyte, and this is where fertilization takes place. And fertilization is chemically influenced. Fertilization happens usually from sperm from a different prothallus. And of course the sperm swim there. Okay. And this is also where the zygote develops. Okay, only one zygote develops on the heart-shaped gametophyte. Okay. And in effect, the gametophyte dies as the sporophyte develops from the zygote. Okay. And the sporophyte, of course, is a part of the fern that we usually think of as a fern when we think of ferns. Okay. Now we have fossil relatives. Okay, so fossils are ferns and relatives, and ancestors abound. And there are ancestors in the Devonian formations 375 million years ago. They look like wisp ferns. Okay. There are fossils of tree ferns that are 250 to 320 million years ago. Okay, so tree ferns were especially abundant during the Carboniferous. They were so abundant that it was referred to as the age of ferns. But they discovered seeds on some of these plants, so they abandoned the name of that era. Okay, so human and ecological relevance. It's an ideal indoor plant, needs little light. It's not so susceptible to aphids, mites, mealybugs, and other pests like that as other plants are, other indoor plants are. They're also popular outdoors too as ornamentals, and they are air filters. Okay? A Boston fern can remove 1,800 micrograms of formaldehyde in a 10 by 10 foot room in 1 hour. That's pollutant, and this formaldehyde is a pollutant from carpets, and formaldehyde can actually cause renal problems and renal disease. Okay? That's pretty important. Okay? So the ferns can actually help clean up your environment. The EPA, in fact, okay, say that a fern can almost completely rid the air of pollutants daily in a room. Okay? Another thing too is commercial anthurium growers in Hawaii, okay, use native tree ferns or hapu'u. Okay, there's a nice hapu'u plant there. Okay, for the tree fern, rhizome or root bark, okay, as a medium for orchids, bromeliads, and staghorn ferns. Okay, in fact, demand for the fern bark for orchids exceeded the supply for years, so fern bark is extremely expensive. Okay, now as the fiddlehead unrolls, the hairs on the petiole and the rachis become apparent. Okay, and the hairs of the tree ferns were used for upholstery, pillows, and mattress stuffing. And in the late 1800s, 2,094 tons, more than 2,094 tons, were shipped from Hawaii to the mainland. And if it weren't for a substitution, okay, of materials, it might have been completely destroyed, all the tree ferns of Hawaii, which is called the mother of the forest, because the seeds of Mitrosideros polymorpha, the ohia lehua, actually germinate sometimes in the bark of the tree ferns. The Polynesians use the hairs of the pulu for embalming. Okay, they're dead. And Hawaiian tree fern yields red dye for cloth dyeing. Okay. Bracken fern was once used for food by livestock and humans, especially in Japan and New Zealand, but they found that it produces tumors in lab animals. Okay. Now, indigenous peoples ate cooked rhizomes and young fronds of different ferns. Okay. There are uses in folk medicine for different things. Native Hawaiians ate starchy cores of the tree ferns as famine food. And these are some of the uses that the ferns were put to in folk medicine. Okay. Diarrhea, dysentery, rickets, diabetes, fever, eye diseases, burns, wounds, skin problems like eczema, leprosy, coughs, stings, insect bites, antidote to poison, labor pains, constipation, dandruff, and other maladies. Okay. Ferns are also used for basket weaving with the chain fern by Native Americans. Okay. Basket weaving was also done with the climbing fern by Southeast Asians. Okay. They had rachis up to 40 feet long. And the mosquito ferns, or the azala, very small ferns, less than ½ an inch big. They form dense mats. Okay. What they do is they kind of suffocate mosquito larvae. Okay. And not just that, is that they actually have cyanobacteria that fix nitrogen. Okay, called anabina. That's the cyanobacterium. And so it reduces the need for added fertilizers. Okay, now what we're going to do is going to take a look at some of these plants that we've been talking about. Okay. So we see here we have some fern allies, some members of this group that are related to ferns and all have vascular tissue. Okay. So first of all, we have the lycopodium here. You can see the microphyls. Here's the rhizome. There's a rootlet. Okay. Here's a stem. Okay. This is developing. Right. So this is lycopodium. Here's selaginella. It's kind of hard to see, but there are definitely ligules at the bases of the leaves of this, and you can see that they are different from each other, even though they're both called club mosses. Okay. They're fern allies. Okay. The vascular tissue. Now this, of course, is equisetum, okay? You have one here that is a non-reproductive structure, and here you have another that is reproductive structure. You can see the strobilus here at the tip. Okay, you can see the stems coming out here in whorls at the nodes, and here you can see the leaves, dried and brown, not green. The stem would have been the part that would have been green, and you might be able to see the lines in the stem here. Okay. We'll put these aside and we'll take a look at some ferns. So here is that little native rare fern called Marsilia. It sort of closed up on us here. Still very beautiful. I think you can get them at plant sales like that. Marsilia villosa, a rare fern. Okay. And here we have Lawaya fern, okay, with the sori on the back. The sori are made up of sort of sporangia, and they have annuluses that just kind of fling the spore out, you know, when the spore needs to go, depending on changes in humidity and also changes in pressure in the air. Okay. And here's a leaf of an ikaha fern, a bird's nest fern. And you can see here the sori also on these. So the sori can be different shapes depending on the fern. Okay. And here you have a couple of pinnate ferns that are pinnately compound. Yeah. Remember pinnately compound, you have a rachis and you have the leaflets coming off on the side here. Okay. And here you have palapalai. And this one is 3 times pinnately compound. You have 1 time pinnately compound, 2 time pinnately compound, and 3 time pinnately compound. So ferns are quite remarkable. Okay, so go back to the computer. Okay. Hope you enjoyed this tour through the lower vascular plants as much as I did. And hope you enjoyed looking at the plants, and hope you enjoyed finding out all about their sex lives and everything like that. Anyway, so I enjoyed myself, and I hope that you did too, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.